Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Aaron. My wife and I had been married for 10 years before everything fell apart. I work as a delivery driver for a regional logistics company. It's not the kind of job that makes you rich. I was making around $34,000 a year, which wasn't bad for someone without a college degree, but it wasn't enough to get ahead either. Haley and I met in our early 20s, got married young, and spent a decade trying to build something together. Like most marriages, ours had its share of ups and downs. We fought about money more often than I'd like to admit, struggled through periods where we barely talked to each other, but we also had good times. Vacations we saved for months, quiet Sunday mornings, and the excitement of buying our first and only house together. That house was everything to us. We bought it in 2007, right at what we now know was the peak of the housing bubble. Back then, everyone said real estate only went up. The mortgage broker assured us we were making a smart investment. We scraped together every penny we had for that down payment. I'm talking about emptying our savings account, cashing out the small $401k I had from a previous job, and even borrowing against Haley's modest retirement fund from her job at the insurance office. We went into that house purchase with basically nothing left in reserves, but we were homeowners. We were living the American dream. For barely 2 years, we lived in that 3-bedroom ranch on Maple Street. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. I'd spend weekends working on small projects. We hosted Thanksgiving dinner for both our families in 2008. These weren't grand gestures, just the normal stuff married couples do when they're trying to build a life together. But the financial stress was constant. The mortgage payment was higher than we'd anticipated, especially when you added in property taxes and homeowners insurance. By 2009, the housing market had completely collapsed, and our house was worth significantly less than what we owed on it. The economic recession hit everyone hard, and I was lucky to keep my delivery job when other companies were laying people off. The delivery business was brutal during the recession. Companies were cutting costs everywhere, which meant fewer packages to deliver and more competition among drivers for the available routes. My employer had laid off 3 drivers in 2008, and those of us who remained were expected to cover larger territories for the same pay. Some days I drive 200 miles across 4 counties, making stops at businesses that were barely hanging on themselves. I'd see the for lease signs in strip mall windows, the restaurants that had closed overnight, the small manufacturers that had laid off half their workforce. Everyone was struggling, and it felt like the whole economy was falling apart around us. I was working longer hours, taking on weekend shifts whenever possible, but it felt like we were always just barely keeping our heads above water. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was delivering packages to people who probably couldn't afford what they were buying. Just like Haley, and I couldn't really afford the house we were living in. The whole system felt like it was built on borrowed money and false hope. Haley started staying late at work more often, and when she was home, we seemed to find new things to argue about. Small things became big things. Big things became relationship-ending things. We'd fight about the thermostat setting because heating oil had gotten so expensive. We'd fight about grocery bills because even basic necessities seemed to cost more every month. We'd fight about whether to fix the washing machine or try to make it last another year. Every financial decision became a source of tension because there was never enough money to feel comfortable about anything. The worst part was watching our neighbors go through the same thing. The Kellys next door lost their house to foreclosure in late 2008. They'd bought their place 6 months after we bought ours, paid even more than we did, and when a man lost his job at the steel plant, they couldn't make the payments. I helped them load the moving truck on a rainy Saturday in December, and the look on their faces was something I'll never forget. They weren't just losing their house. They were losing their faith in the whole idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you'll get ahead in America. 2 houses on our street went into foreclosure within the first year after we moved in. The property values kept dropping as more for sale signs appeared, and we all knew we were trapped. Even if we wanted to sell and move somewhere cheaper, we couldn't because we owed more than the houses were worth. It was like being in financial quicksand. The harder you struggled, the deeper you sank. We'd been in our house for barely 2 years when my marriage with my wife experienced its most significant troubles, but it felt like a lifetime of financial stress compressed into that short period. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in March 2009. I'd just gotten home from a particularly long day. I was tired, probably a little grumpy, and I walked into the kitchen expecting to figure out what we were going to do for dinner. Instead, Haley was sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. She looked up when I came in, and her expression was different from the usual days. She told me she wanted a divorce. She said she was done and wanted me to know that she intended to keep the house. I stood there for a minute, trying to process what she'd just said. The divorce part was shocking enough, but demanding the house felt like a punch to the gut. This was our home, the only thing of real value we'd managed to accumulate together in 10 years of marriage, even if it was now worth less than we owed on it. I asked her why she thought she deserved to take the only substantial thing we owned together. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "You can't afford a lawyer to fight me." Her answer is burned into my memory. She was right, and we both knew it. I was making $34,000 a year as a delivery driver. After the mortgage, car payments, insurance, utilities, groceries, and all the other basic expenses of life, there wasn't money left over for legal fees. Good divorce lawyers charge $300 to $500 an hour, and contested divorces can drag on for months. I'd looked into legal aid programs, but my income was just slightly too high to qualify, and the waiting lists were months long anyway. So I looked at her and said the only thing I could say, "You're right." I think she expected more of a fight. But what was the point? I knew the math as well as she did. She had saved up money for this moment, probably been planning it for months, while I was obliviously coming home every night, thinking we were just going through a rough patch. The truth was, I wasn't entirely surprised by the divorce. Our marriage had been on life support for at least a year, but the house demand blindsided me. I'd assumed that if we split up, we'd sell the house and split whatever debt remained. The idea that she thought she could just claim ownership and force me to walk away with nothing showed me how differently we viewed our relationship. To her, apparently, I was just someone who helped pay the bills while she built her future. What really hurt was realizing that while I'd been working extra shifts and trying to figure out how we could make things work financially, she'd been consulting with lawyers and planning her exit strategy. She'd probably known exactly what she was going to say to me for weeks before that conversation in the kitchen. I was playing checkers while she was playing chess, and I didn't even know there was a game going on. A week later, I was served with divorce papers while loading packages into my delivery truck. The process server was polite about it, professional, but there's no dignified way to be handed divorce papers at work. A couple of my coworkers saw it happen, and word spread pretty quickly through the depot. That's the thing about working-class jobs like mine. Everyone knows everyone's business, and suddenly everyone's got opinions about your life. My supervisor, Dean, pulled me aside later that day. Dean was a good guy, probably in his 50s, who'd been working for the company for over 20 years. He'd been through his own divorce back in the early 2000s, and he had some perspective on the situation. He told me not to let anyone at work know the details of what was happening, because some people would try to use personal problems against you when it came time for promotions or route assignments. He also suggested I talk to someone at the credit union about my options, because divorce could mess up your credit in ways you didn't expect. That conversation with Dean made me realize how unprepared I was for what was coming. I'd never thought about things like credit scores or asset protection or any of the financial complexities that come with divorce. I'd assumed that if Haley and I ever split up, we'd sit down like adults and figure out a fair way to divide things. I was naive about a lot of things back then. I spent the next few weeks trying to figure out how to represent myself in court. The Legal Aid Society finally called me back, but they were dealing with a 6-month backlog and could only offer me a brief consultation. The paralegal I spoke with was helpful but honest. Going into family court without representation against someone who had hired a lawyer was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. She gave me some basic forms and wished me luck. The first court date was scheduled for a Thursday morning in July. I'd requested the morning off work, which meant losing a day's pay, but there wasn't any choice. I arrived at the courthouse early, wearing the only suit I owned, a navy blue one I'd bought for job interviews years earlier. The family court building was intimidating, with its all-marble floors and high ceilings. I took a seat in the gallery, watching other cases get called before ours. Haley arrived about 10 minutes before our scheduled time, and she wasn't alone. She had hired a local family law attorney. He and Haley took seats on the other side of the courtroom, and I could see them reviewing documents, looking prepared and professional. When our case was called, I walked up to the defendant's table by myself, carrying a manila folder with my handwritten notes and the basic response forms I'd managed to file. The judge was a middle-aged woman. She looked at both sides, clearly noting the disparity between Haley's representation and my situation. But before we could proceed, another lawyer walked in. I know who he is. My brother, Alan. We had fallen out many years ago. I knew he was practicing law, but I never thought about calling him to come help me. As he walked towards my table, I wondered who had given him information about my case. What I couldn't understand was why he was walking toward my table. I'd never met Alan Morrison, never hired him, certainly never paid him any money. But he sat down next to me, opened his own briefcase, and started arranging papers as if this had always been the plan. The judge proceeded with the preliminary hearing, and Alan introduced himself as my counsel, filed an appearance on my behalf, and suddenly the entire dynamic of the courtroom had shifted. The hearing itself was mostly procedural, setting timelines for discovery, scheduling future dates, and establishing temporary orders for who would stay in the house during the proceedings. But having Alan there changed everything. My wife's lawyer couldn't steamroll over an unrepresented party anymore. Every motion he filed was met with a counter-motion. Every demand was challenged with legal precedent and case law I'd never heard of. When the court adjourned, Haley practically cornered me in the hallway. She wanted to know where I'd gotten the money to hire such a lawyer. She accused me of hiding assets, of lying about our financial situation throughout the marriage. How could I claim to be unable to afford basic living expenses, but somehow come up with a retainer for a divorce attorney in the county? Before I could answer, Alan stepped in. He looked at Haley and delivered the line that would define the rest of our divorce proceedings. He doesn't have to afford me. I'm his older brother. I guess he never mentioned me to you all through your marital years. The look on Haley's face was priceless. She had no idea I even had a brother, much less one who practiced law. Alan and I had taken very different paths in life after high school. He'd gone to college on an academic scholarship, then law school at Penn State, and built a successful practice over the past 20 years. I'd gone straight to work, bounced around between jobs for a few years, and eventually found steady employment as a delivery driver. We didn't see each other anymore after he slept with my then-girlfriend. I swore that I wouldn't see him as my brother anymore. I would later find out that our mother called him about the divorce, and he didn't hesitate to get involved. He told me, after a court session, that he saw this as a way to make up with me for years, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. Over the next 6 months, the divorce proceeded through the court system at the typical pace of family law cases, which is to say, slowly and expensively for everyone involved. Haley's position remained consistent throughout the process. She wanted the house, claimed she had contributed more to the household over the years, and argued that my income was too unstable to handle the mortgage payments anyway. Her lawyer filed motion after motion trying to establish sole ownership of the marital home. Alan's strategy was different and more straightforward. In Pennsylvania, where we lived, marital property gets divided equitably between spouses. The house was purchased during our marriage with marital funds. Both our names were on the deed and mortgage, and there was no prenuptial agreement that would suggest otherwise. As far as the law was concerned, Haley had exactly the same claim to the house that I did, 50%. The court ordered a professional appraisal of the property, which required hiring a certified real estate appraiser. This was an additional expense, but it was necessary to establish the fair market value for any potential settlement. The appraiser spent 3 hours at the house, assessing the condition of the property. Her report, filed with the court 6 weeks later, contained news that none of us wanted to hear. Our house, which we'd purchased in 2007, was now worth less than what we paid for it. The housing bubble had burst and property values in our neighborhood had dropped by almost 10%. When you factored in the outstanding mortgage balance, the house had significant negative equity. We owed more than it was worth. This changed the entire calculation of the divorce settlement. The judge reviewed the appraisal report and the financial disclosures that both sides had filed. Our total marital assets consisted of a house with negative equity, 2 vehicles, about $3,400 in combined checking and savings accounts and retirement accounts, with less than $8,000 total value. After 10 years of marriage, we had essentially no net worth. The judge's initial proposed solution was straightforward but impractical. If Haley wanted to keep the house, she would need to buy out my 50% interest and refinance the mortgage in her own name. Based on the appraisal, since the house had negative equity, this would actually mean she'd get the house, but would also take on the full mortgage responsibility for a property worth significantly less than what was owed. It should have been a terrible deal for her. She'd get a house that was underwater financially and take on debt that exceeded the property's value. But Haley and her lawyer refused this arrangement. They demanded that she receive full ownership of the house without any financial obligation to me, and they wanted me to remain responsible for half the mortgage debt even after losing any ownership interest. It was an unreasonable position that no court would ever approve, but her lawyer filed the motion anyway. Alan's counterproposal was simple and based on legal precedent. If neither party could agree on a buyout arrangement, the court should order the house sold, the mortgage paid off from the proceeds, and any remaining debt divided equally between us. Given the negative equity situation, this meant we would both walk away owing money to the mortgage company. But the debt would be split between us rather than one person taking on the entire underwater mortgage. The court proceedings dragged on for another 3 months, while her lawyer filed various motions trying to avoid the sale. He argued that Haley had contributed more to household maintenance, that she had a greater emotional attachment to the property, and that my income instability made me a poor candidate for homeownership anyway. Alan systematically demolished each argument with financial records, documentation, and case law. In November, almost 8 months after the initial filing, the judge made her final order. The house would be sold, and if the sale proceeds weren't enough to cover the full mortgage, we would split any remaining debt equally. She gave us 90 days to list the property and find a buyer, with the court retaining oversight of the sale to ensure it was handled properly. We hired a real estate agent who specialized in distress sales and court-ordered dispositions. In a normal market, we might have been able to make those improvements and get a better price. But we were under court order to sell within 90 days, and neither Haley nor I had money available for improvements. The house was listed slightly below the appraised value to attract buyers quickly. We received 2 offers within the first month, but both were significantly below the asking price. After some negotiation, we accepted an offer from a young couple who planned to use it as their starter home and were able to get financing despite the market conditions. The closing took place on a gray February morning at the office of the title company. Haley and I sat at opposite ends of a long conference table, signing document after document to transfer ownership of the house we'd bought together with such hope just 3 years earlier. After the mortgage balance was paid off, after the real estate commissions were deducted, and after the title insurance and transfer taxes were calculated, we still owed some money to the mortgage company. Haley was bitter about the whole outcome, and I understood why. She'd started this process believing she would end up with a house. Instead, she got half of a debt and had to start over just like I did. She'd spent thousands of dollars on her legal fees, money that could have been put toward something else. Her plan had backfired completely. But here's the thing, I wasn't bitter. The marriage had been over long before Haley filed those papers. We'd been living like roommates who didn't particularly like each other for years. The house had become a symbol of everything that was wrong between us. The financial pressure, the different expectations, the growing resentment about money and responsibility, and whose fault it was that we weren't where we thought we'd be by this point in our lives. My brother, Alan refused to accept any payment for his representation. He said family helps family, and that the satisfaction of watching my ex-wife's face when case after case got dismissed was payment enough. I offered to take him to dinner at the nicest restaurant I could afford, but he just laughed and said maybe someday, when I was back on my feet, we could grab a beer and talk properly. The apartment I rented was small but adequate. 1 bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people, a living room that served as my home office and entertainment center. The rent was $550 a month, which was actually less than half of what the old house payment had been. I could afford to go out to dinner occasionally, maybe save a little money for emergencies, even think about taking a vacation that didn't require months of planning and penny pinching. For the first few months, I felt guilty about how much I enjoyed living alone. I'd been part of a couple for so long that I'd forgotten what it was like to make decisions based solely on my own preferences. These were small things, but after years of constant tension and conflict, the absence of daily friction felt like a luxury. I'd learned to live within my means during the marriage, so managing the extra payment was difficult but not impossible. I completely made peace with my brother, Alan. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the things we fight hardest for aren't actually worth having. Haley spent thousands of dollars and 8 months of legal battles trying to get a house that ultimately cost us both money to get rid of. She was so focused on winning that she lost sight of whether winning actually got her what she needed. Freedom, it turns out, sometimes costs money, but it's worth every penny. Thanks for watching.